Okay, so thank you for coming, Schöne Morgen. Welcome to, this is the third installment of our musical improvisation and ethics seminar series. This is part of our ongoing musical improvisation and ethics project, which is based here at Graz, at the University of Graz, the Kunstuniversity of Graz, and the University of Vienna. So I'm one of the PIs. I'm Josh Bergerman, and we've also got Caroline Gatt and Chris Williams, who are, have been driving force. Well, Caroline in particular has been a driving force of this seminar series, which is supported by the Austrian Science Fund, and particular extra support from the University of Graz and our friends here at Forum Stadtpark have been giving us very generous space. And we're delighted today. We've got a very special guest, Professor Tim Ingold, or Professor Emeritus now, from the University of Aberdeen. Tim needs, I think, no introduction to these people in this room, but I'm here. Tim started his career as an anthropologist, doing field work with the Sami and Lap people in the circumpolar north. But as he says, anthropology is philosophy with the people in it, and his interests are very wide-ranging. He's definitely been a pioneer in exploring issues across different disciplines, looking at issues like skilled practice, our connection to the non-human world, and really, I think, animating debates in all kinds of fields with the knowledge he's taken from the ground. He's authored 12 books, plus many collections as well. His new book is coming out at the end of this year, which will be called The Rise and Fall of Generation Now. He's a recipient of many honors, including last year a CBE, which is one of, I think, the highest honors in Britain one can get as an academic. If I was to do the full formal Austrian thing, introduce him, I would be saying Herr Doctor, Commander, and we would be here all morning. So I would just introduce us to Professor Tim Ingold. We're very delighted to have you here today to speak on how the world makes itself heard.
Thank you so much. Okay, well, there's an old philosophical riddle that goes like this. You've all heard it. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is there, does it still make a sound? And of course the answer is that it all depends on what we mean by sound. And that's really what I want to talk about, what on earth sound actually is. If we mean mechanical vibrations emitted from an energetic source within a certain frequency range and transmitted through a conducting medium, then surely the falling tree will make a sound as its heavy trunk strikes the ground, sending shockwaves through both the earth and the air. But if by sound we mean a certain human perception brought about by the stimulation of a particular sensory organ, namely the ear, and the receipt of neural impulses by processing centers in the brain, then clearly there can be no sound without someone with ears and a brain to register it. And there's no denying that in ordinary usage, these two meanings of sound very often get confused, such as when we speak of the speed of sound, as if the noise we actually hear had traveled like a package from its source, riding the waves, rather than just pitching up at its oral destination. Or when people talk about the rhythm of a sound as something having to do with the frequency of the sound waves that are transmitted from the source to the recipient. These two things are always being confused, and particularly in discussions where maybe somebody involved in music or aesthetics is talking to somebody from physics, and they mean completely different things, and they're always at cross purposes. So that's what I want to try and sort out. But I think it's also symptomatic of the poverty of much of the philosophical debate around these matters, that it offers no other option than these two. Either it's mechanical vibrations, or it's this thing in the head. It seems as though sound can only be either in the world or in the head, either physical or psychic. But what if sound were neither one nor the other? That is, what if in order to get to the root of our experience of sound, we could set these particular binaries aside, mind versus world and physical versus psychic and so on. And I think to achieve this, we have first to drop the peculiar logical detachment of the thought experiment, so beloved of philosophers, and plunge into the experiential maelstrom of the world itself. So let's not just sit here in a nice, sterile, beautiful room and I wonder what would happen if a tree fell in the storm. Let's actually go out there and see what happens. So suppose that you are walking in the forest, in a howling gale. It's dusk, and the light, already dimmed by heavy cloud, is fading fast. And as it darkens, the ambience seems to thicken as the lightness and transparency of sunlit air gives way to something closer to a viscous fluid. The trees, whose textures and colors had shown up so vividly in broad daylight, are now but a shadowy presence, and you have to peer through the dusk to make them out. So you have to extract their shapes and forms from the mist. And from all around you, you hear the creak of branches as they rub against one another and as the wind tears through their leaves. You feel perhaps like a mariner at sea, listening out for the creaking timbers of his vessel as it is tossed by the swell. And as the mariner finds himself cast in a realm of ocean and sky, for you likewise, earth and atmosphere together comprise a world in flux. It's a world in which things are not already laid out like objects and properties on a stage, but from which they are forever emergent, like folds or crumples of the flux itself. Such is the ocean wave that the mariner hears in his creaking timbers, and such is the gust of wind for you, heard in the creak of tree limbs. Then, all of a sudden, a massive gust comes roaring out of nowhere. A splintering crack, at first hesitant, intensifies into a crash, like that of a breaking wave, shortly followed by a thud so heavy that it takes you in the pit of the stomach. The very earth seems to shake. And in that moment of the trees falling, you are as swept up in the melee as is the mariner whose ship is about to capsize. Your entire existence borne along in the turbulence of a milieu that is simultaneously cosmic and affective. And this milieu is what I want to call an atmosphere as where the cosmic and the affective realms, so to speak, merge with one another. So what I want to argue is that sound is neither physical nor psychic, but atmospheric. It is an implosion of the milieu that somehow rends the flesh of your own being as much as of the world. So it's not as though when the tree falls, it makes a sound, which is subsequently broken off from its source and dispatched like a package to you, the recipient, to unpack its significance. So, tree falls here, sound, boom, thrown over, you're standing here, you receive it. You say, oh, that was a tree falling. So it came across from the tree to you as a package of sound. Rather, the sound is the atmospheric event of the trees falling. And the circumstance of your being there at that particular place and at that moment inevitably makes you a perhaps unwilling accomplice in the tree's final spasm. So the sound itself is an index of your complicity. Actually, you were part of that event. And perhaps recalling the event afterwards, telling a story, you might explain that, oh, I was in the forest and I heard this terrific sound and I guessed it must have been the sound of a falling tree. But you know that's not how it was at the time. So there's, in a sense, a difference between story and narrative. If life is lived like a story, then that being there at that moment, that's part of the story. The narrative is what you tell afterwards, where it all looks very different, and you could tell it in a setting like this, far away from where it actually happened. So now let me introduce another example. Suppose it's not the trees falling that you hear, but a rumble of thunder. Now, compared to the suddenness of the crash when the tree hits the ground, the rumble is perhaps a more drawn-out affair. It alternately grows and fades in intensity. And whereas the crash appears to erupt from an epicenter somewhere in the woods, the rumble echoes, or seems to echo, around the entire sky. Now we know that the proximate cause of the sound lies in the explosive blast of air superheated by a lightning bolt. And that is how physicists would explain. That's how thunder is formed. And we're all familiar with the fact that in our perception, the flash of lightning precedes the rumble of thunder by a measurable interval that allows us to estimate how distant the storm is from where we stand. You see the flash, you count 1, 2, 3, and then boom, and then you work out, okay, the storm is exactly 2 kilometers away. We've all done that. And this is because compression waves are transmitted through the air at roughly 1 million times slower than electromagnetic rays. So whereas the rays of light reach us more or less instantaneously, the sound waves seem to take their time. In fact, it's approximately 5 seconds for every mile. However, the rumble that fills your ears, like the flash that dazzles your eyes, is of an entirely different order. It's fair to say, indeed, that there would be no rumble without ears and no flash without eyes. But I think it would be wrong to conclude that thunder and lightning exist only in the mind as objects of perception. Indeed, I don't really think they are objects at all, but rather the reverberations of a consciousness that, far from having closed off from a world out there, has opened up to the boundless expanse of sky. And I'd like to put in a bit here, because I've been thinking about exactly the same issues in relation to light. You see a flash of lightning, and we have the same question. Is this a question of rays that are traveling from the source to your eyes, or is the lightning something that actually happens in your own, in the way that you won't join in your own consciousness with the movement that is actually going on? Because the flash doesn't travel in a straight line. It can be a zigzag. And whereas the ray of light that goes from the source to your eye would normally be depicted as a straight line. Or just to give you one more example, which I like, I'll draw it, because we often have this on a, imagine a sort of Christmas card. It's the wrong season now because it's spring, but here's a candle, and there's the candle flame, the wick here. And then we draw these lines. And then you ask, well, which of these here's a flame, right? It's supposed to be sort of going a bit wiggly, but sort of generally in an upward direction. Here are the rays, straight lines that are illuminating whatever surfaces they fall on. And you ask the simple question, which of these is light? Is it the rays or is it the flame? And I'm continually getting these mixed up. We see the flame shining. But the shining, the wiggliness of the flame is something in which we join with a movement in the world in real time. And it's quite distinct from the rays that are issuing out from a point center somewhere here. So what I'm saying is it's exactly the same question with sound. This, rather than a candle flame, this could be a streak of lightning, okay? And it's going like that, and we pick up that streak. That streak is to do with a path of combustion, actually, and it's got nothing to do with the lines of radiation that transmit that light energy from the source to your eye. So I just want to be clear about that distinction. But once if you accept this distinction, then it means having to think differently about ears. Now, anatomically, of course, the ears, these things here, are organs of exquisite design, delicately primed to respond to vibratory stimuli, and firmly cemented on each side of the head. And the head is a hard, bony cavity, inside which lies the soft material of the brain. So from an anatomical point of view, the ears function as what we would call transducers, picking up vibrations impinging from the outside and converting them into neural impulses for interior processing. So that's how it would be described in a textbook on the anatomy of hearing. But in our experience of hearing, there is no inside and outside. Where anatomically our head should be, there lies the world. That's the funny thing. I mean, I can see my trousers and and I can move my sight up, and then I come to this, but without the aid of a mirror, I can't see my face. It's the one part of my body I can't see. And you can try this experiment where you tap your finger on your forehead, and you say, yeah, okay, there seems to be a bone here. There definitely, but I can't see it. I can only see it if I go and look in the mirror, but I know that it's what everybody else can see. And when you do this and you think, what is my finger doing here? It seems like an alien presence that somehow has inveigled itself into the field of vision. I sometimes had the same feeling about, because I play the cello, and when you put your finger on the fingerboard, and you can certainly feel that hard fingerboard under there, but you think, what is this doing in the middle of what is actually a field of sound? It's as though it's got in the way. It's just like the fingerboard for a cellist is just like your forehead when you're singing. You don't really you don't really see it as such or hear it as such, but it's there, and if you concentrate on it, it seems to get in the way. So there's this odd thing that in our experience, and let's not bring in mirrors or anything, there is no inside and outside, and that where anatomically our head should be, there lies the world. Well, if that's the case, if there's no inside or outside, what on earth do we do with the ears? Where do we put them? Have the ears, along with the head, somehow dissolved into the ether? Or have they rather merged with our listening? So if, as I suggested, sound is not so much an object we hear as the underside of our own experience of hearing, and if that's what it means to be possessed of ears, then a walk in the woods on a stormy night would find ourselves literally in a forest of ears all around and above. Every creaking branch, every falling tree, every fold of the thunderous sky would be listening to you, even in the passion of your listening to them. Now, no one, of course, would be so foolish as to think that ears actually grow on the branches of trees, or that they fly around like flying saucers in the sky, but that's not the point. It's not, you see, a question of anatomy, but of affect. Now, to get to the bottom of it, we could imagine ourselves set down, as in real life was the ethnographer Bronislaw Malinowski, and here I'm bringing out my anthropological persona, set down in real life on the island of Kiriwina, on one of the islands of the Trobriand archipelago off the eastern tip of Papua New Guinea, where we are witness to the performance of garden magic. So the magician, squatting alone in the corner of the garden, planted with the staple crop of yams, addresses both the soil and the yams whose abundance he aims to secure. And as he launches his words, rumbles of thunder and gusty winds, which are common in that season, portend that the world is listening and that the words have been received. And in due time, the yams will swell below ground, while above it the luxuriant growth of vines and drooping foliage attest to a plentiful crop. Now, the islanders are convinced of the beneficial effect of their magic, but to their ethnographer, it remains a puzzle. Surely they can't believe that the mere utterance of esoteric words causes plants to grow. Plants, as Malinowski acknowledged, have no ears, but people do. So could it be, he wondered, that the magic works its effect precisely because words intended for plant beings that have no ears actually fall on the ears of beings, namely human, for whom they are not intended? So he's saying that perhaps actually the magic works because the plants can't hear, of course, but other people can hear, and it works its effect that way. But if that's the reason, then why on earth should the magician sit all alone in the garden with no one else within earshot? There isn't actually anybody else around to hear the magician's words, except for the elements. Now, the real answer, I would suggest, is that by lending his voice to the chorus of earth and atmosphere, the magician brings about a kind of affective resonance, a commingling of energies, wherein lies the potential of the cosmos to generate new life. So the cosmos is full of this generative potential out of which plants grow and people grow. And by chanting his spells, the magician is joining with that and adding a bit to that overall generative potential of a world. But as he listens for a response from the thunder and the winds, the magician lends his ears as well, because it is by way of the ears that meteorological phenomena such as thunder and winds can take on an audible presence. And likewise, to return to the tree falling in the storm, by lending your ears to the tree, you create the conditions for its cry to be heard. You give the tree a voice that it would not otherwise have. Thanks to your presence, the tree can listen both to itself and to everything around through you. So it's as though you are actually allowing the tree, by becoming part of the tree, becoming complicit with the tree in its falling, you give the tree a voice such that it can then be heard. Now, if the idea of lending an ear to the tree appears a little surreal, it's no more so than asking other people to lend theirs, as you know did Mark Antony in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, when he exhorted his fellow Romans. You remember, friends, Romans and countrymen, lend me your ears. Now, he didn't ask them to part with their organs of hearing. He wasn't suggesting that they cut all their ears off and give them to him. When he said, lend me your ears, he was asking his audience to give him a voice. Give him a voice and let it be heard. which means aligning their attention with what he has to say to draw them in. If nobody is listening, he has no voice. He only has a voice because they are attending to him. And that's what he means by lending your ears. So the ear, in this sense, is the attentiveness of a body placed on oral alert. That's to say, not so much a body with ears as what we could call an ear body. I've drawn this idea of the ear body from a sound artist and dancer called Fabrizio Manco. He wrote a paper called Ear Bodies, Ear Lines some years ago, and I also worked with him on his PhD thesis many years ago, so I just wanted to acknowledge Fabrizio's work here. So the idea comes from him. But then how do you turn a body with ears into an ear body? Well, you first have to decompose it anatomically so that it can then be reconstituted as something like a tissue of affects. And this isn't a surgical operation, of course, but a switch of perspective from acoustics to phenomenology, or from objectification to experience. And I might just mention in passing that, again, I have exactly the same feeling every time I sit down to play the cello, that when the cello is sitting there in its case, you know, there it is, it's an object, manifestly an object that's been put together from parts, a very beautiful object, and it's sitting there in a case, it could be exhibited. But then I get it out, get everything ready, sit down, pull out the spike. And you might think, okay, then I'm sort of anatomically joined to this object. I'm a sort of centaur, like a half human, half cello, with a spike for a leg. And so I'm an anatomical unity. But at the moment I begin to play, that unity completely falls apart. And there's just, I'm all movement, breath. The instrument is no longer an object, but something that of wood and wire and air and everything's sort of everything's up in the air somehow. And out of all this comes a sound. So it's certainly, when I'm playing, it's not an interaction between me, human being, and cello object, because both I and the cello have ceased to be an object at all, and we've just become a bundle of affects out of which comes the experience of sound. And the curious thing is, I've not spoken to other instrumentalists about this, but I used to have dreams, and in my dream, the cello has completely fallen apart. It's in pieces, and so am I, and it's slightly scary. But then I realized that actually this dream reflects what happens as soon as you begin to play. So that's a sort of aside, but it's that kind of decomposition that I'm talking about. When you dissolve the very idea of a thing as an anatomical entity joined together from parts and recompose it instead as a bundle of affects, an affect being what a material does when it is alive and active in the world. So with that switch from objectification to experience, the ears are no longer the organs of a body, as the anatomist might portray them, but the affective disposition of a body without organs. Because the idea of the body without organs comes from Deleuze. It's in his own writing. It's, to my mind, I couldn't make head or tail of it. But when I began to realize that actually that's what, when I started thinking about the ear body and what that actually meant, I realized, oh, that's what he means. That's what he means. He means the body without organs is a body that has been anatomically decomposed in that way, in such a way that it can then be reconstituted as a bundle of affects. So that's what, I think that's what he means by it. And in this perspective, the body is not a self-contained entity enclosed by an external skin and set over and against the surrounding world, but perhaps something more like a probe or an antenna that feels its way into the folds and along the creases of the crumpled atmosphere, threading through the milia, much as a plant root or fungal hypha threads its way through the earth. So I'm trying to think of the atmosphere as a great crumple. If you take a piece of paper and I don't know. Take a piece of paper, screw it up like this into a tight ball, and then, sorry, I have to put this down. Then you have to, then you unfold it, and you get this beautiful landscape that's full of ridges and valleys, and so I could say I'm interested in let me follow this particular valley and see where it goes. And you can try and follow it. So listening to a particular melodic line, for example, is like following one of these folds in the crumple. But each is not. It's not an object. It's constituted by the very crumpling of what is actually a continuous material. Now, this is because somehow two-dimensional. But if you imagine the atmosphere as just a mass, continuous mass, like a sponge, and you just squeeze it, then it would be full of these irregularities, folds, places of high density and lesser density, of transition points. And that's what we're talking about when we're following a particular line. I mean, glider pilots will tell us about how their experience of the atmosphere, for example, is something quite different from most of us just see sort of a blank and maybe say, oh, it's a very windy day. But if you're a glider pilot, you have to be, you can, for example, if there's what you call it, a thermal that's rising up and you go straight into it, it's really like hitting a brick wall, and that it can be, and quite, so you have to know about these things. So one's actually dealing with a continuous matter, a continuous mass, which is crumpled in all sorts of complicated ways, and responding to that, whether by hearing, vision, or any other sensory modality, is following the lines and contours of those crumples. So, just remember that the ear body finds itself in a viscous medium in which things are not already given in objective forms, but have to be made out. So making out is an act of differentiation, of discerning shapes and contours from within the flux in which all are primordially immersed. So that means that to hear a sound is not to identify an object or an episode of this or that kind, like this is a falling tree or that is a rumble of thunder, but to enter into the grain of the event, cleaving it from within and to follow where it leads. So it is in effect to trace a line. Just to say, I said with this crumple, I might pick up a line and trace it as far as it goes. In just the same way as if you're a walker in the mountains, you would want to follow a particular ridge and see what happens. So that then is what we could mean by a line of sound. But the key thing is that line of sound is absolutely not a line of transmission. These respective lines of sound and transmission have quite different properties, and it's crucial to recognize the distinction between them. And it was the same with light. I mentioned you might say the line of a fork of lightning, for example, might go like a zigzag line, but the line of transmission of radiation that you might draw from a source like a candle to an eye would be a straight line with completely different properties. So a line of transmission connects an energetic source with a sensor. It could be a human ear, but it could just as well be some kind of recording device. And that's what we have in mind when we say, as we commonly do, that sound travels from A to B, or that it reaches our ears from someplace far off. We imagine the line to be straight, though in fact it may be bent on account of variations in atmospheric density, deceiving us into supposing the source to be much closer or further away than it actually is. I mean, this is like refraction in light for instance, I found living in the Arctic, for example, that sometimes you can hear pinpricks of sound from an enormous distance because of the way in which the sound is bent by variations. It's very cold at the surface and a bit warmer further up. It effectively bends the thing so that you can pick up something from a very long way away. So you get these illusions that things sometimes appear closer than they actually are. But compression waves travel through the air under normal pressure and in a temperature of around 20 degrees at approximately 343 meters per second. That's the line of transmission. But the line of sound doesn't connect points, but lasts or carries on in real time along a path that twists and turns with continuous variations of pitch, timbre, and amplitude. So then you might ask, well, how fast does this line of sound travel? And I suppose that all depends on the conduct of its source. I suppose that I hear your approaching footsteps, and as my own hearing joins with the rhythmic pulse of your gait, why then the sound appears to travel at walking pace. Again, with light. Imagine you're walking through the corridors of an old mansion, dark, holding the candle, and you think, how fast is light traveling? Well, actually, if light is the flame of the candle, then it's traveling at the speed of it's not traveling at what we call the speed of light, it's traveling at walking pace as it's going along. And it's the same with sound. So in that sense, say if you're listening to footsteps, then sound walks just as you do. Now, for most human beings, throughout the interval of life between infancy and infirmity, walking on 2 feet is the way of getting around that comes most naturally to them. But again, the anatomy of walking is not the same as its phenomenology. I mean, the mechanics of bipedality sees the body equipped with its several organs of sense and motion displaced from point to point across a plane surface. But in our experience, walking is an instance of a kind of movement I would call wayfaring, which is characterized by the fact that it does not connect points or stick to a predetermined course, but continually improvises a passage in between in ongoing response to a perceptual monitoring of the entire milieu as it unfolds. So you're continually finding a path in between the points. So in walking, the wayfarer's body becomes the line of its own movement. I mean, just when I talked about the ear body, the ear body is something like an antenna or a probe that is finding its way through. It's the same with the wayfaring body. And so the body becomes the line of its own movement. And like the root or hypha, it grows from the tip and leaves the thread in its wake. Because it's true that not all wayfaring not every walk goes quite like that. I mean, there are exceptions, sort of A to B movements like the forced march. And also not all wayfaring is done on foot. I mean, you might do it on horseback or by bike or even on occasion by car. But what is peculiar about walking as wayfaring is the characteristic rhythmic alternation by which with every step, we lift one foot and fall forward, only to restore balance as it grips the ground ahead, allowing the other foot to be lifted, and so on. So it's an alternation of risk and recovery. So walking along, you hear the rhythmic pulse of your own steps, moderated by the textures of the ground underfoot, whether hard or soft, gravelly or squelchy, mingled with the sounds of the wind in the trees, the creaking branches, distant thunder, and all the other phenomena to which you lend your ears, bringing them thus into audible presence. So the question is, how should this earthly and atmospheric chorus be described? Well, many would call it a soundscape, but I'm not convinced that this term is entirely apt, because the chorus is not already laid out, waiting to be surveyed. I mean, the soundscape is done by analogy to the landscape, and the landscape, we think of this as this sort of scenario, this panorama. It's already laid out, and you can then survey it. But the soundscape is not what we're talking about. This chorus is not like that, nor can it ever be played back as a totality, because it is ever unfolding in the contrapuntal interweaving of multiple strands that can really only be unraveled and individuated from the inside. So the shapes of sounds, I've suggested, they can only be made out. And as we make out the shapes of sound, we make ourselves out as well. So like figures in the mist, both we and they have no substance apart from that of the milia, in the folds and creases of which all existence hovers. So, to conclude, I'm trying to argue that to listen is continually to be reminded that we are not just possessors of the world in which we move around and find our being, but are possessed by it. So it's not then that hearing provides a portal for the human mind to take possession of the world. It is rather that in taking possession of its human inhabitants, the world makes itself heard. The tree, taking possession of me in the forest, makes itself heard and gains a voice, but only because I, in that moment, have become part of what the tree is. I'll stop there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Tim. Very thought-provoking talk. We'll take a short break now. We'll take about 20 minutes. So we've got plenty of fruit and coffee and tea and things for you to help yourself. For the people at home, you'll have to provide your own. But let's come back here at 12:10 and we can have a discussion with Tim. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. Thank you for sticking around. So we have about an hour left for question and answer. So plenty of things to talk about. If you like what you're hearing as well here and you're interested in the themes of this project, I also invite you to sign up to our newsletter. Benedict can put that in the chat. You can speak to us later. So we have a lot of people online, I think, about 70 people. So we might go back and forth between people in the room and online. But please, if anyone has any questions, we're open. Yeah, so we need to use the microphones just.
First, thank you very much for this very inspiring presentation. One question that became apparent to me is the function or the weight of language somehow, because it seemed in your presentation is very much focused on this phenomenological layer of experience and how experiences become entangled in the atmosphere. And we make these thought experiments where we are kind of retracing the scenario you're laying out by listening to your words. And so there's this, for me as a person that is involved a lot in artistic research, is a strong question, this relationship between experiences, experiential physical things, and the mediating layer of language, and how that has a place in your model in a way of sharing and of experiences.
Okay, thanks. That's a great question. I might sort of begin to answer it by referring back to the garden magician in the Trobriand Islands, who is vocalizing often in words that are incomprehensible, maybe even to him, where it's actually the sound of the words, rather than any kind of specific semantic content that is supposed to have its effect. So the question, the key question here is the balance in language between the affective resonance of sounded words and any semantic content that might be detached from the sound itself. I mean, this is the essence of the whole debate in our Western tradition surrounding the distinction between speech and song, and the problem of what happens when you go to the opera. You know, whether can you hear the words and listen to the music at the same time. We have a we, meaning people who've grown up in the Western tradition, often have this idea that that language is rather special, insofar as when we hear speech, we think we see through the sound in order to capture the meaning behind the sound. And that's what really matters. You know, if you're listening for something, you're listening to the news, you're listening to people telling you what platform the train is going from, you need to get the information, and that the sound is merely a way in which it's delivered, but it's the information that counts. Obviously, if you're listening to music, it's the sound itself that counts. And so we tend to draw a division between speech and song along that axis. But anthropologically speaking, we know that that's not a division that people normally or naturally make, and particularly if people are not accustomed to seeing the written word. And so I would prefer to start off from the essential unity of speech and song, and say that no, and not to assume a priori that language is different, but to start from the assumption that in speech is one of the ways in which we human beings make ourselves present in the world, give ourselves an oral presence, and that comes before any particular messages we might be wanting to say. So, for example, in a crowded room, you come in and you say, David is there in this room, because you know David and you know his voice. But you immediately recognize the presence of somebody in this crowded room from hearing their own particular voice, and they're talking. So it's in a way that the way one is using language there simply as a way of being present in the world is prior to whatever anybody might be trying to say with the language. And that then helps to remove any kind of essential distinction between we humans and all sorts of other presences that also declare themselves by their sound. The birds, the waterfall, the wind, all these things, the trees, also make themselves present by way of our experience of sound. I'm not sure where I'm going with this, except to say that there's a particular Western predilection for sorry.
I wouldn't challenge that. I'm just curious that we made the thought experiment of going to the forest. And so I'm not sure it has to do with the spoken word in that sense. I mean, I'm just imagining if I had read your manuscript and followed your thought experiment of going to the forest, to the forest of ears or whatever it is. So isn't there a specific layer? What is? I'm just curious about the transition from the actual experience, and if it's all rooted in the actual experience, or this transpositional layer of language, whether that's written or
right.
or oral?
And it's such a big question. It's such a difficult question that I'm not sure if I know quite how to answer it. I don't think I would want to picture it in terms of adding a layer. I think it's something more to do with. Well, it is to do with perspective, obviously. And I mentioned just in passing this possible distinction we might make between story and narrative. The story being the actual living of it, and the narrative being talking about it afterwards. And it's kind of difficult to do this, to talk about things afterwards without language. And maybe the thing about language is precisely that it allows us to talk about things afterwards. And I have a feeling that maybe human beings really are different from all other creatures in their ability to do that. And every other creature might live its life as a story, but I don't know of any other creature that can live its life as a story and tell the stories of other lives at the same time. And that might be unique to human, and it might be something special about language. And that once we think about language in terms of its narrative power, that then leads us to view its sound in a different sort of way, perhaps more semantic and experiential. But how we make that crossing is really, actually, somebody could do a research project on it. How we actually make this transition from one to the other is really, it's not a simple thing. It's not simply a matter of, we'll just put on another layer. I think it's something very complicated.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tim, for the very inspiring thoughts in your presentation. And the topic went to the garden magician. That's a good thing. I will connect to the garden magician. Yeah, I have 10,000 questions and comments, I think. But I ask one very simple question and give you a comment related to the question, if it's possible. The garden magician sits in the corner of the garden and chants something to the crops, to the plants. We can, of course, muse about and ponder what this person is doing, but as anthropologists, shouldn't we ask the person what he or she is and how and why doing, and acknowledge the answer? Because I read the Ingold theory is that there is this cosmos atmosphere thing that's joined by the magician chanting within this whole environmental movement. And with that, he or she kind of joins the chorus of life. I invent that. Is that good?
Okay. Yeah, that's nice.
And there's the Bernd Brabetz theory, that's mine. And I would say that this chanting is about time. So the magician synchronizes with the environment, and by using up time and communicating time by using the sonic mode of communication within his or her community, which maybe is not present but knows very well that the person is in the garden, synchronizes the human collective to the cycles of the environmental collective. It's not about trying to manipulate the plant growing. It's about getting the community into the temporal succession of events of growing and so on. Yeah? That's my theory. But maybe the probably animist-based magician, when asked, will say probably something like people told me in the Western Amazon, which is not Trobriand Island, but maybe related, that actually plants are in a different facet of the world. Plants are persons who can be socialized with, and that his chanting is directed to this facet of the world where the plants are persons with ears, with ear bodies, understanding very well what this person is chanting in order to kind of build this circle of human crop interaction, which is something totally different again. So I think there are many possibilities of saying that the body is this, or the ear is that, or the sound is this, or the sound is that. And I think when talking about philosophy with people in it, that is anthropology, we have to at least mention what the people in it are saying about what they are doing in the world. Thanks.
That's fair enough. And of course, in the particular example of Trobriand garden magic, we can only know so far as what Malinowski tells us. And I can't remember exactly what Malinowski says in that context, but it's probably to the effect that he asked the garden magician, and the garden magician says that by doing performing these spells in the proper way, in the proper place, in the right order, you'll get a better crop. End of story. But that's because Malinowski's own view of things was that magic was basically a technique, that it was done in order to secure practical effects in the world. He had a very sort of straightforward, practical view of this kind of thing, and that's the way he thought about magic. And so we only get what the people told him, as it were, through his interpretation, which was a long time ago, and the rest of it. So we have to make allowance for that. I mean, one other example which I didn't use and could have done by a much more recent ethnographer, and this gives me a chance to mention it, is what's become a classic book in anthropology by Julie Cruikshank, a Canadian anthropologist. It's called Do Glaciers Listen? And she worked with Tlingit people who are indigenous to the northwest, the panhandle of Alaska. Very, very mountainous region with some of the most active glaciers in the world. And in Tlingit history, these glaciers have sometimes surged, suddenly started moving very, very fast with absolutely devastating consequences. Whole villages, communities can be simply wiped away. So this is part of their history that these events have taken place. And Cruikshank explains that Tlingit people say that glaciers listen, and unlike geologists, she's comparing Tlingit people with geologists, and for geologists, they're thinking about it in a very scientific way. But for the Tlingit people, glaciers listen, and because they can hear, and because they listen, you have to be very circumspect in their presence. And you shouldn't offend them, demean them. So, for example, there is a little rule which says that you should never, ever, in the presence of a glacier, cook bacon in a frying pan using white lard. Now, the simple reason, if you cook lard in a frying pan, after a while it begins to bubble, it begins to melt, and it makes a crackling sound. And what that means is basically you're pretending to be a little glacier melting there, and saying to the glacier, "Look, I can do this too, ha ha." And the glacier says, "Well, you think." And then the glacier says, "Well, don't be too big for your boots. And now I'll show you what it really means." And then we'll surge. So it sounds silly, but you can kind of see the point. And my Julie Cruikshank's is trying to get us to see how a glacier is present in the lives of people who actually experience it on a day-to-day basis, and I think again that nobody is so stupid as to suggest that glaciers have ears. But again, it's the same thing that actually, if you are close to a glacier, then the glacier actually overwhelms your own being to the extent that you become glacier. When you're looking, when you're hearing, when you're feeling, you're looking and hearing and feeling with ears and eyes and skin that have been overwhelmed by the glacier's presence. So that it's as though actually the glacier's listening is your listening, because the glacier is listening through you. So it's a bit the same kind of argument as I was presenting here in the case of the tree. But as you say, there could be more to it than that, because particularly with the Tlingit, we're certainly talking about people like in Amazonia with a kind of animistic ontology. And it might well be that there is a domain of reality in which it makes perfectly good sense to say that glaciers have ears. It's not ears as we would understand them, but ears in some sense of understanding, just as people in Amazonia might say that plants have ears. And I was thinking about this recently in relation to birds, and because I was writing something about how birds might hear their own songs. Well, we don't know. It's very difficult to know exactly. But in the end, I came to the conclusion that if we really wanted an answer to this question, we have to ask a Shipibo Konibo shaman. Because there's a particular group indigenous group in Peru, I was using as an example, and because the shaman, in part of their practice, becomes a bird themselves, and actually begins to inhabit a different kind of world, in which when you look into the eye of another being, you see a soul. And I figured also that in the case of birds, it was very, seeing and hearing are almost exactly the same thing. Well, that was my argument anyway. So that there is a domain of experience accessible to shamans and to birds and possibly to plants, which simply won't accord to any kind of naturalistic description. And our challenge then is to try and say how on earth to render this in a way that can be understood. So I think I'm with you in that sense that, as you said, Malinowski was writing a long time ago. We don't have access. We don't otherwise know what the people said except through his records. But there's still work to be do. I think we still have work to do in order to try and figure this one out.
Do we have anybody online, Benedict?
So there's one question online from, and excuse please if I mispronounce the last name, Ricardo D. Wanke or Wanky. My question is about the parallel between light versus sound and between vision versus audition. I find quite a strong difference in the temporal aspect. Sound is intrinsically and inexorably temporal, while vision is essentially spatial. How do these two aspects enter in your portrait? In this respect, you also discussed the role of surfaces in our audition, drawing on Gibson's ecological perspective. I find here again a difference between vision and audition. That is a difference between a contemplative and a immersive stance. What is your idea about that? Thank you.
Okay. Well, my idea is I think that there's a long tradition in post-Enlightenment thought, or actually perhaps in post-Greek thought, of making a very big distinction between vision and hearing. It's a distinction that's not so radical in other societies, in other cultures, but we make a big thing of it. And I've been wanting, of course there are differences, but I've been wanting to reduce them as much as possible. Because I think a lot of the difference, or the alleged difference, between vision and hearing rests on a kind of category confusion. And it comes from the way in which so often we compare sound with vision. I think there's something wrong here. if you're going to compare like with like, then we should be comparing sound with light, not with vision. So when we talk about vision, we say, I see this or that. I see people. I see trees. When we talk about sound, I hear this sound. That's different. So suppose that we focused entirely on the experience of light and said, okay, let's compare the experience of light with the experience of sound. Then we'd find that they have much more in common than we thought. An experience of light could be the shining of the sun, or that lightning flash I was talking about. These things have a temporality. They unfold over time. And just as much as sounds do, because one is talking, you're watching the candle flame or the light of a fire. This thing is unfolding in real time. It's something in which your own awareness has got hooked onto an unfolding process of maybe combustion in the atmosphere. Or just to give one other example that I like very much, Van Gogh's famous painting of the Starry Night, where he has stars not as pricks in the sky with lines radiating out from them, but as swirly-whirly things like this. And he wrote to a friend when he did this painting, he said, I want to try and paint the sky in such a way, not that you just get a sudden view of it, like you took a snapshot photograph, but what happens if you really open to it and spend time with it. So he's trying to depict the stars as you're out there in the night, looking at the stars, and your attention wanders among them. And as your attention moves from star to star, it goes around and then it goes like this. And that's exactly what he painted. So if we compare sound with light, and if we recognize that light is like shining, glowing, twinkling, that these are processes in the world, they have a temporal dimension just as pronounced as sound does. Or if we go to the other extreme and say, okay, no, vision is about looking at objects, then, okay, you can do exactly the same thing with sound. I heard that door slam. I heard that bird call. It's an object in the world. That's it. So I don't actually buy the argument that sound is temporal and, by the argument that vision is spatial, but then hearing can be spatialized too. And just as sound is intrinsically temporal, light is intrinsically temporal too. The reason being that both are part of the unfolding of our own awareness in real time. So that's my answer to that one.
Sure, thank you. Also, just to the people at home, if you'd like to read your own question as well, you can just put your name in the chat and we can put you online. I think I had Chris next.
Thank you very much, Tim. A juicy presentation as usual. I had a question about the tree. I think there was more than one tree in this talk. The first one that I remember was the tree whose voice is heard by way of the person listening to it. And the second tree I remember was towards the end, and that was a tree in the chorus of life. And they strike me as two different trees, or two different kinds of trees, because the first tree, in a way, is depending on human agency for its voice to be heard, whereas the second did not. And I felt a little bit uncomfortable with what I understood to be the portrayal of the first tree, because I thought, well, trees are talking and singing to each other all the time, actually. They're sending signals to each other. The animals and the parasites that live in the trees are also communicating with each other. And so if you think of the tree as not just a thing, but as a sort of system of life, then It doesn't require human anything to be singing or to have its voice heard, so to speak. And I wondered if, did I understand that wrongly, or was that just a foil for reaching the portrayal of the tree as part of the chorus of life?
I think you're probably right. I mean, we immediately get into the question of what a tree is, and where, and I think, you know, what is tree and what is not tree? Where does a tree end and the rest of the world begins? And those questions can't sensibly be answered because they're kind of nonsense questions. When we realize that actually what we are calling a tree is really, I think, a sort of knot. Like it's like so. Just put that down for a moment. I mean, we're in a picture book, you know, there's tree. All of that is tree, and all of this is not tree. But then you think, well, there's the bird, and the insect, and or the leaf, and the leaves, and the what about them? And then you soon realize that actually the tree is all sorts of things, all sorts of lives that somehow get tangled up together with loose ends. It's a knot of different stories. And you were talking about all this communication that's going on. I mean, each of those, it could be a fungal hypha, it could be a boring insect, it could be a bird. These lives are all tangled up together in this great big knot. And we say, okay, that knot, that's the tree. So that all these lines, which you could call communicative if you like, where sort of stuff is going along one way and another, following a path or a trail, getting tangled up with other stuff. There are places where the knot gets very tight, particularly closely tangled, and those are the things we tend to identify as saying, oh, that's a tree. So it might be that the distinction when you said there are two trees, which I think is true, and a fair point, is that the tree I began, the tree I ended with, is more like that. That's the chorus of life thing, a kind of knot, a bundle in the chorus. The tree I started with is as though that bundle is itself suddenly finding itself sliced off. A sort of a crisis, a calamity in that, so that when the chorus is going on, things are kind of okay. Everything is bundling along together, but then obviously in the storm there occurs some sort of tipping point, literally, where the tree can't stand up anymore and it tips over. I mean, they're just the other example that I used to compare it. I was comparing it with a ship at sea, a sailing ship at sea in a storm. And imagine yourself as the sailor inside this ship, and it's close to capsizing, and you can hear all the creaks and groans of. It's the same thing. This is close to a tipping point, but imagine that ship sailing along in fairly calm seas. There's definitely the chorus there. There are all the different parts of the ship, the sails, the fish in the sea, and the seagulls, everything going along together, and that is what the ship is. So you're right that I haven't done it here, somehow make a distinction between the constitution of the chorus and what happens when that somehow collapses. I'm not quite sure how to do that without going back and thinking about it, but that's a good thought.
I have a hunch that there's some relationship to the cello of many parts falling apart.
Most likely there is, yeah. Well, I'll need to think about that some more. This is a good question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much for your very inspiring talk. I have a question that grows out from a small debate or questions that we had in the break, actually. And we were wondering maybe if we either misunderstood you or if you could clarify your notion of decomposition. So you were talking about this kind of this experience of being like a centaur when you play the cello. So this being half human, half cello, and you would expect then that this leads to an experience of being in unison with the instrument, like the musician being in unison with the instrument. And then you talked about something, and I don't remember exactly what it was, being decomposed. So what is it exactly you're referring to? Because in our discussion we couldn't match the thread. It's an unexpected concept to be, or verb to be used in this context. So maybe we didn't get it right. So
okay, thanks. I mean, maybe decomposition is the wrong word. I'm not quite sure what the right one would be. I wanted to get. I mean, nothing kind of physically is happening. It's not as though the instrument is actually falling apart or coming into bits. Well, physically something is happening. Is that you're starting to play, but as soon as you start to play, then you get into a kind of different modality of being. Another example I've used sometimes is again walking. You can plan to go for a walk, get everything ready and so on, but still think about it in a sort of, that's my walk, that's separate. But once you start walking, then your being is entirely wrapped up in the movement. So it's not just that you walk, but your walking walks you, and you're inside of it. And so I think the same thing happens when you actually start to play, like get moving. And the sound bubbles up, then it's not just you playing, but your playing is playing you. I think it's the same with speech too, or singing, or anything like that. So you're inside what is going on. Now, I think so. What I'm trying to talk about is the switch of perspective that happens as you move from looking at the cello in its case. There it is, it's an object, it's outside you've got nothing to do with it necessarily, it could be in a museum, to the case when there's a lot of sound, a lot of movement, and you're there right inside of it. And that you can only make that switch if you kind of loosen up in some sort of way, because if everything is solidly joined up and attached to everything else, then there can't really be any movement. So you have to, so that the decomposition I'm talking about is how you switch perspective from saying there is a material object made up out of these component parts, to here are various materials, each of which has to be understood in terms of its affective properties, the way it moves, the way it flows, the way it responds to touch or whatever, and then see how those materials then come together in a performance. So it's a movement from that, and this has some theoretical significance, because in say the study of material culture, I'd say, are you looking at objects that are made out of these components with these significances, or are you talking about materials which have certain properties and sensory properties in particular? So that's what I was getting at. There was something else anyway, yeah, there was something else that was at the top of my head, but I've lost it now.
So it's more about the idea of the cello being an object which is decomposed then in the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think then I got it. Yeah.
Yes, but it's true that decomposition might not be the best word, but then I don't know what up is. Yeah, I mean, opening up might
merging.
Do it, but yeah, it's
merging, like the musician and the instruments are opening up and merging, maybe.
It is emergent in a sense, but at that point, then it is as if the instrument explodes, and that explosion, you're then inside that explosion, because the explosion is itself the performance. It's not a one-off thing. It carries on, and you're inside. And I've exploded as well, exactly. That's the point, because at that moment you also turn yourself inside out, so to speak. And Chris will know all about this, because but we know we have to warm up. So actually what that means is that this explosion, this transition is easier said than done.
It doesn't happen.
It doesn't happen just like that.
Yeah.
And so any string player, I'm sure it's the same with other kinds of, knows that it can take hours until you've really reached that place where you've actually got inside the movement.
During your talk, I had to think of a documentary which I watched, which portrayed people who have neither vision nor they have the ability to hear, so they're basically blind and cannot hear, and which was very interesting. Not so many people are affected by that condition, but there are some, and they have, of course, a very specific perception of the world as the perception ends with their fingertips. They have no remote senses, and but all people that were portrayed in the documentary, they had a great love for music, and yeah, basically like putting their hands on the piano or lying under it, or yeah, with of course having like developed very great sensitivity for touch and for that sensory options, and so they kind of have the ability to hear without using ears. I was just wondering what that like does to the argument, and because of course they wouldn't like hear the tree falling, but they also wouldn't see the tree falling, and like
but they would certainly sense it.
Definitely, yes.
In fact, that's really interesting, and I mean I don't know about that because I've not seen this documentary, but I'm trying to remember. I was corresponding with and met once a researcher based in Bergen in Norway who had been working with young people who had been suffered severe trauma from something like a car accident or something like that, and so he was doing therapy, trying to reinstill some measure of responsiveness in a human being that's otherwise lost most of it. In this case, due to accident, and he was. I'm trying to remember, but it was really fascinating that he was talking about how he would make models of the hand and use those models to touch the keyboard, and even if the person couldn't do that because they were incapacitated, it was actually possible to generate or you could see that the person was responding. I just can't remember enough. This is enough detail, but somehow your question triggered a memory of this. That you're talking about people who, for whatever reason, have lost their sense of vision and hearing, and there's a sort of similarity with people who've suffered a brain trauma, and it's a problem of how one can rekindle some sort of response. It's the same thing, that it happens through touch, as on a keyboard. But the thing that I find rather fascinating is that, well, if we're talking about touch, there are I think there are different kinds of touch, and there's a kind of touch that we're familiar with when we use touch screens, which actually involves no sensory involvement with the surface at all. It's simply a matter of if you're typing something. I've just become a possessor of a smartphone. You see, so I just discovered that you have this keyboard and you can type things on it, and it's just a matter of getting your finger in the right place to get the right letter, but you can't really actually feel it. And we call so often now because we're getting used to these digital technologies, we call that touch. And I think that doesn't seem like touch to me. Because touch to me involves usually at least some sort of sensitivity to the surface that comes about through some sort of stroking movement or something that would and a pianist would say that obviously you have to have that kind of sensitivity to the key. So that then the interesting question is that when this sort of work is being done with a finger on a keyboard, and it elicits some sort of response, what kind of touch actually is it? A simple tap that tells us nothing about the surface, I think doesn't do it. And I think that that's very significant.
Quite short on time, we're time for two more. So.
I'm not quite sure how to pose this question because I want to say first that I really like to follow you, and I really like the idea of thinking in a different way and following the creases in the paper and the creases in the way how we think about the world. And I understood your talk also as a kind of philosophical debate, trying to avoid binaries, as you said in the beginning. So to me, I belong to the, let's say, indigenous people of Western-trained classical instrumental performers. But I'm also a professional artistic researcher. And in artistic research, I'm really struggling with the concept of that knowledge is that an artwork, that in an artwork knowledge is inherent. So I'm really thinking about how do we produce knowledge? How can we think differently? How can we think differently? How do we not fall into the trap of Western educated thinking? And to me, you, I'm sorry to say that, but you fell into three traps. So the first one was when you talked about the magician, and I thought, okay, now I'm really curious. For a long time, you avoided to say if it's a he, if it's a she, if it's a they, but then in the end, of course, it was a he. So maybe that's just a story of the researcher. In the end of your talk, I think, as I understood you, the final sentence was that the tree needs us, the human beings, to be heard. So I thought, okay, now we are back at the anthropocentric worldview. And then when you talked about your experience while playing the cello, you said you started and then you said, but in the end, it's not the cello and the performer, two objects. It's not them together being one object, but it's a bundle of effects. And then I thought, well, as a professional player, I just don't agree, and I have the feeling that you fell in the trap of this romantic, mysterious image of how artists should be or present themselves. And I just wonder, what can we do to think outside the box? How can we? It's really is a methodological question. It's really a little bit. It's a big challenge for me, and I
Okay.
Yeah.
No. The first question is easy to deal with. I mean, ethnographically, the garden magician in Trobriand society is a man. Okay. And there's nothing we can do about that. That's the way it is. If it had been a woman who does garden magic, then I would have said she. But it just happens to be that in that society it's a man, and always is, so far as I recall.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
on the second question, this is more significant. I actually think that there's what we could call a benign form of anthropocentrism, and that we should actually argue for it. This is quite a long argument, but I think that the word anthropocentrism is usually used critically to label a position which puts humans at the top of a pinnacle with the rest of the world, non-human world, down at the base. Sort of geometrically, that's incorrect, because a center is not up there. A center is actually down there in the middle. So we get these rather absurd positions in much of the literature saying we want to introduce a real body-centered view that counters dominant anthropocentrism. You're putting the human body in the center and you say you're arguing against anthropocentrism. There must be something wrong here. And so I think, okay, we can have an anthropocentrism that does put the human being there in the midst of things, from which experience and duty radiates outwards, not just to other humans, but to everything else in this world that we inhabit. And it's only because we're there in the middle that we can exercise the responsibilities that fall to us for other beings in the world, not just human beings. And therefore, actually, anthropocentrism is just what we need. And it's not just a matter of getting the terms wrong, but also because for those of a post-humanist persuasion who are arguing most vociferously against anthropocentrism, you say, what is their alternative? Their alternative is an ecocentrism that leaves the human with no positive role to play in future flourishing. I think the sort of future I would want is one where we can find a genuine role for human beings to exercise their responsibilities towards the rest of the world. And I do think that human beings do have a responsibility that other creatures don't. And that's because of a thing I raised earlier, which is that I don't think any other creature can tell the stories of other lives whilst also living its own. And I think that gives humans a particular responsibility for looking after this world that we find ourselves in, which is also a view that would be taken by most indigenous people around the planet. So rather than going all out against anthropocentrism, my stance at the moment is to argue for a good anthropocentrism, and I think that's the way to go. And maybe that came out a little bit in what I was saying now. The third point, I appreciate what you say about romanticism. That there is it's easy to go all gooey-eyed and romantic about the way in which you become one with your instrument, blah 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 blah. But I don't know. I mean, like most, I'm only an amateur, but and I just play the cello because I enjoy playing it. And I don't have enough time to practice, and it's frustrating, but anyway. But I think like most players, whether they're amateur or professional, there are good and bad days. And and the instrument has moods. And there are days when you're in a really good mood and you think, I'll be great today, I'll pick up the cello, it's going to be marvelous. And it's the cello, it just doesn't want to do anything. And then you try harder and harder, and it gets worse and worse, like digging a hole for yourself. And there are other days when you're in a really stinking mood, and you think, well, I'll take out the cello anyway, and the cello says, it's all right. And it just sings. And it seems like you don't have to do anything.
Well, as a professional, I still don't agree. Sorry.
You don't have, maybe that's why it is that, because I've always wondered with professional, how is it that when you hear professionals play, it sounds like their instruments are always in a good mood, whereas mine get in a bad mood in one day and a good mood on the other. But maybe it depends on the instrument.
We're really out of time, although...
Thank you very much.
Make it very, very quick.
Or the dialectic relation between what you do as an artist or a researcher. But I just want to return and ask you for one last definition, or sort of explaining a bit more closely what you distinguished at the end of your talk. Thank you for the beautiful talk. You were talking about soundscape and it's sort of the wrongness of the term in relation to landscape as something laid out. And I was a bit puzzled, because as far as I understood what you have written about landscape, this is sort of a distinction I don't really follow now. So maybe you could give us as a definition, what is landscape and what is, in contrast, what you criticize as soundscape.
Sorry, I did slide over that one, and it's only because I think that most people, well, at least when the term soundscape came in, obviously by an analogy or by an extension from the idea of landscape, it was modelled on a conception of landscape as something that is already laid out, even though that's not a conception that I would agree with, and I think I've written about this separately, but there are many reasons why I think that that soundscape doesn't really work as a concept. Part of the problem was at the time when it came in, there was a fashion that somehow land and scape had been split apart from one another, and there was a fashion for thinking of all kinds of scapes, and I felt that actually, when I was influenced by this, by conversations with a historical geographer, Kenneth Olwig, who's made the point very powerfully that landscape is not some new invention of Dutch artists in the 16th century. It's a very ancient medieval term, and the connection of the scape with the land is absolutely intrinsic. And scape is not about vision at all. It's about shaping. It comes from the Old English scapen, meaning to shape, not from skopos. And so landscape is about the way in which medieval farmers were shaping the land with axe, hoe and plough. That's what they meant by landscape. And therefore, there was an intrinsic relationship between the shaping and the land. And if you split the word apart, land plus scape, you're immediately falling into the hylomorphic model of the land being just this physical baseline and the shape being something imposed by human agency from above. And then if you extend that to start talking about soundscapes, you get into all sorts of troubles. That's why I don't think the word really helps. For me, a landscape is there's a word it's a unity, or I've tended to sort of go from the idea of landscape to this idea of an earth-sky world, and a unity of earth and sky that is continually being formed and shaped through sort of intercourse, a dialogue between the earthly and aerial elements, which is where everything grows. So I'm trying to find a different language, actually, to talk about that.
I know that there's plenty more questions and plenty to say, but unfortunately we're out of time. We are going for lunch very soon, so those of you who are here are welcome to join us. And if you're interested in this, we'll be back here on the 1st of June with Bernd. We'll be speaking his own topics, but for today, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for all your questions and your interest, and please join me in thanking Professor Tim Ingold for a very stimulating discussion.